Welcome back, everyone. I'm the Bella Gamer, and today we're gonna be talking about I, I guess the safest mech in all of Lancer. Granted, the Minotaur and the Calendulas, this is gonna be a double license, are hacker mechs that act so interestingly because they're hacker mechs that act kind of like defender mechs. It's very hard to explain, and to be fair, the science behind this one is also very hard to explain. So why don't we just go ahead and get into the license so you guys can see exactly what I'm talking about. So looking at the stats here, we do see a lot of HP, but zero armor. And so this is the interesting thing about armor in Lancer, and I think this is a good mech to talk about it. Because armor in Lancer is not necessarily like a general damage mitigation, but it's kind of a balance between HP and armor depending on the types of attacks you're going against. For instance, auxiliary weapons tend to hit on average 2 to 3 damage. So, having 1 to 2 points of armor makes auxiliary weapons pretty ineffective. But when you start using heavy weapons or even super heavy weapons, you start taking, 6, 7, 8, potentially 10 damage or more. And 1, 2 points of armor is nice, but that's about a 10 or 20% amount of mitigation versus, like the more HP you have. The best example I can give is if we have the Minotaur here with 12 HP and it gets hit by a 5 damage attack, then it can take 3 hits before taking a structure damage. If this was a mech with 8 HP but 2 armor, it would still take the same amount of damage to get through. Granted, the enemy doesn't have any kind of armor penetration or anything like that. And that just makes it balanced. Even though the 2 armor would be way, way better if it was an auxiliary weapon, making you stand probably twice as much HP equivalently, the higher the damage is, the more the number kinds of balance out. So the Minotaur is a very interesting mech because it has 8 HP, average evasion, a higher than average E defense, which makes sense. It's a hacker mech. It has a low end of average for heat capacity, a strange sensor range. It's one of the few mechs that don't have a sensor range that's in multiples of 5. And it has a sensor range that puts it essentially at just out of skirmishing range. Most skirmish weapons have a range of about 5 hexes, so 8 puts you just out of that, but not quite at artillery range. Now, this mech does give a +1 to its tech attack, and it has a save of 11, which is actually very handy considering all the saves it does through various parts of the license. Its repair capacity is on the lower end, and it has a higher than average of system points and a pretty decent speed on the low end of average, but higher than a good number of mechs, honestly, in the game. So this is a pretty sturdy mech that has a good range of about somewhere just out of medium range. It's between medium and long range, giving it a very interesting playstyle. But let's take a look at the traits, and this is what I mean by it being the safest mech in the game. With its internal metafold, which is the second trait here, which I want to talk about first, you can't be harmed in any way. So even if your mech gets destroyed or explodes due to its reactor going off, the pilot is safe. So narratively speaking, you can play way looser with this mech than any other mech really in the game. And this is actually a very strange, because the last Horus mech we ended up talking about was the Manticore. And the Manticore is the exact opposite. It's a mech that wants to die so it can blow everyone up, but the pilot will go with it. This mech allows you to die, so you're actually more likely to want to put yourself in situations where your mech will get destroyed, even though you don't get as much benefit as like the Manticore does. It's very, very interesting. The inverted cockpit is also a very interesting trait. It allows you to essentially mount or dismount your mech as a free action once per round. And it's something that I don't know exactly how this is supposed to be super useful. And I mean, it has an additional benefit that when you eject from the mech for whatever reason, it doesn't become impaired. So I guess this mech is a really good mech if you like using AI. If you have some kind of AI you want to operate your mech, then your pilot can kind of come in and out of the cockpit as they pretty much see fit without really interrupting your mech's turn, which is interesting to say the least. I don't know exactly how I feel about it specifically because there's not really much use for pilots outside of mech cockpits. And when you use an AI, it operates in a very specific way. If you set it to defend itself, it'll do anything it can to defend itself, but it won't really do actions outside of that. So that is it. I don't know what real benefit that does. And these first two traits that we're looking at here are not very much combat oriented. I mean, I guess internal manifold means you can play a little bit faster and looser with the Minotaur, but it doesn't really give you extra advantages. It just doesn't punish you the same way it does other people. Now, the last one, localized maze, is actually really interesting and a very fun trait. So, hostile characters cannot pass through a space occupied by the Minotaur for any reason and must always stop moving when engaged with it, regardless of size. This allows the Minotaur to kind of act as a roadblock for an enemy, no matter the situation, which is very interesting. Now, I don't know if this necessarily affects intangible because it says for any reason. I would like to think it does because that makes it more fun and interesting. But even if it doesn't, I mean, I don't know why you would necessarily set yourself up because the kit seems to be designed for kind of a longer range. And actually, to kind of play into that as well, we have here just a singular main aux mount. Now, for having only one mount, a main aux mount is really not that bad. And so I'm not going to really gripe about it, but it only has one mount, like at all, and it can get some extra mounts with core bonuses, or at least one. But this is not a striker mech, and it's very hard to make the Minotaur work as a striker mech unless the only weapon you're using is like a main melee weapon with maybe an auxiliary range. And even then, it, you can't like really do a whole lot with it. I mean, you can full barrage. No, you can't even full barrage unless you pick up another mount. So yeah, I don't know. It's a very interesting map. That's not what you're going to use it for anyway. You mostly are going to be using the Minotaur to hack. And in fact, let's go ahead and take a look at its Metafold Maze, its core system here. So the Metafold Maze is actually a passive, so you can use this at any time. So I'm going to hide my camera here real quick so you guys can see. So when you hit with any tech attack, you may activate this system for a quick action, causing your target to become slowed until the end of your next turn. If they're already slowed, they become immobilized, and if they're already immobilized, they become stunned until the end of your next turn. Each character can only be stunned by this effect once per combat scene, but slowed or immobilized by this any number of times. And let's talk about the active part of this as well. Choose a character within sensors. They become stunned as you hurl their systems into a metaphysical information trap so tangled that they can't do anything but try to escape. So essentially, there's a lot. I didn't read any of it. This is a full action that you activate, and essentially the enemy is stunned for until the end of their next turn at minimum. And then they make a +3 difficulty system save to try to get out of it against your save. If they succeed, they're no longer stunned. But if they fail, they can try again at the end of their next turn, gaining 1 accuracy, essentially countering 1 difficulty each time they do so. Meaning that if they fail enough times, they eventually just start getting accuracy to their systems. But obviously, being shut down for, even 1 round is pretty good, but for a full action, that's a little rough. But the +3 difficulty makes it much more likely that the enemy is likely not able to succeed unless they roll really well, which, I mean, there's a 25% chance, typically in most situations, that they're going to be able to get out of it on any one of their rolls because they just roll so high that the difficulty typically won't make a difference. But that being the case, this is still easy, like an easy 2-turn stun as a full action, which that is pretty devastating, honestly, for any enemy team to have a person just completely locked out. So with the Metafold Maze, one of the cool things about it is as a quick action, as long as you're consistently using tech attacks every round, you progress an enemy until they're eventually stunned and they become so slow or immobilized that they are just sitting ducks for your team. And this allows you to focus an enemy down really hard. Now, this isn't as good as spreading about. So depending on the battles, if it's a bunch of chaff enemies, Metafold Maze kind of doesn't do a lot. And honestly, its active maze effect isn't super effective against chaff enemies either. But if you have enemies that are much more dangerous, like enemy Lancer pilots, for instance, then we're dealing with a mech that can make anyone's life a living hell if their systems are not super jacked. So that being the case, the Minotaur is a very interesting mech. It's a defensive style of mech, and the license plays into that. Its whole point is locking enemies down and pretty much just burning through enemy systems. But let's go ahead and take a look at the other the other frame here in the license, so you guys can see what makes the Minotaur license even cooler. So we have the Calendula, which is a very interesting mech. I love this design here, especially because I don't know what this is. It like piecing itself back together? This image just invokes so much thought and imagery. I also love the hooves for the feet. I think it's really cool. This is an interesting version of the Minotaur. It's also a controller, but the Calendula is actually a closer range version of the Minotaur. Looking at the base frame traits here, we do see now, and kind of an inverse, 2 armor and 7 HP. 7? Not an even number? So strange. Now, its evasion is a little bit worse, but its E defense is still good. I think it has a higher heat capacity, same sensors, same tech attack, lower repair capacity, same save, same speed, and same system points. So the biggest difference between the Calendula, stat-wise anyway, and the Minotaur is the Calendula has less HP, but more armor, and is slightly easier to hit. Now, the Calendula would be one that I would invest in your whole skill, pilot skill, to make it stronger, because the higher your HP is, the more big shots you can take. But the Calendula is really good against dealing with enemies who are not using heavy firepower. So good with dealing with skirmishers or other types of enemies that just kind of come in and out, trying to whittle you down, as it's pretty decent armor. 2 armor is really good, is more suited for that kind of thing. Now, its frame traits, though, are a little out there. So you can see here, this first trait is insane. Sculptor of Fate is really cool because every time it hits with a tech attack, the Calendula creates essentially a ghost of the enemy, what's called a Void Husk. And that enemy, or that husk, can be placed within range 3 of its target, and it creates a burst to area that essentially slows down all enemy units. Now, on top of that, the Void Husk is intangible, and its effect affects both intangible and tangible objects at the same time. And the type of enemy you use this against, so if it's a size 2 mech, actually makes a size 2 Void Husk, meaning technically the bigger the target, the bigger area you can create with it. It also can create any number of Void Husks, and they don't go away until the end of the scene. Now, this is a very interesting one because the Void Husk is an intangible object that doesn't cause obstruction, which means that even if you're intangible, I guess it doesn't obstruct you still. Otherwise, you wouldn't need to put that part, or they're overcomplicating it by saying it's intangible and doesn't cause obstruction, when they just mean it's intangible, so it doesn't normally do this for normal enemies. It also states it's immune to all damage and effects, and so I'm assuming that even if you are intangible, because if you didn't know, intangible is kind of a dimensional thing. When you're intangible, you can only affect things that are intangible, and you can move through things that are on the normal tangible, verse. But this thing is just immune to all damage and effects, and I'm assuming that means even if the target is intangible. Now, a benefit to the Void Husks is they only affect hostile characters. So the Calendula is very interesting because it wants to tech attack as much as it can to create as many void husks as it can to slow the enemy down. Now, if you're unfamiliar with slow just means that the only type of movement you can really take is your standard movement. The next trait here, the Grammaton Law, is where the Calendula wants to be closer to its enemies than the Minotaur. Because with Grammaton Law, you have any slowed hostile characters are also shredded as long as they're within range 3 of the Calendula. And then the Grammaton Mantle is very interesting because it allows you to, as a protocol, become intangible until the start of your next turn. So, that being the case, this mech wants to be close, and the effects are kind of contrary in some ways. So, intangible has this thing where no effects you do while you're tangible or while you're intangible can affect anyone. So, if you use Grammaton Mantle to get close to an enemy, you actually don't shred the enemy because you're intangible and you're on a different plane of existence. So you can't really use Grammaton Law and with the Mantle unless the enemy is also for whatever reason intangible. Now, because the husks typically get created when you're tangible, they'll persist even after your mech becomes intangible. Now, the ability to create void husks anytime, once per round anyway, that you successfully hit with a tech attack seems pretty good, but in actuality, you're only creating a few zones of burst 2 that slow in a combat. Most combats aren't super long. So and they're very high paced. A lot of mechs do move around a lot. So the Calendula is good at keeping enemies out of certain zones that don't want to be slowed, or kind of cornering an enemy, slowing them, and then shredding them with its effects. But because it only, similarly to the Minotaur, has a main aux mount, it doesn't have a lot of firepower to really back up cornering an enemy. So this mech has a very interesting design. Now I think it's good, and I think the Minotaur is also good. The thing is that they kind of only come like halfway to what I feel like ideally they could be. Because the Calendula looks like it's a really good mech designed to block off a bunch of areas and to corner slower mechs and beat them down when they're shredded. And it makes it really good to deal with armored enemies because the enemy is shredded. And you can still do that for the most part. I mean, you can still skirmish with a main ox, using both your mounts if they're both like a melee or range, as long as you're within range 3, which, there are some really decent weapons to do so. And it has good armor, and the Minotaur has good health. So these mechs kind of want to be somewhere near the front line, with the Calendula being closer, and the Minotaur kind of staying a little bit out of range. But they don't have a lot of firepower to really do a lot, but their allies can do it. So the Minotaur is really good at working with a team, but it's not really good at soloing out enemies necessarily by itself. Now, the Calendula does have a really cool core system. The execration of names of the unworthy undead, which is insane, but that's just horrors for you. So let's take a look at these particular parts of the mech. So once per round, you can target another character within range 3 of a void husk or yourself and banish them to an interstitial space. Allies can choose whether or not they're affected by this, and hostile characters can avoid being affected by this by making a successful system save. So essentially what happens is when you use the passive, which is a quick attack you can use once per round, you can force an ally or enemy to become intangible. And they're intangible until they move next to a void husk, in which case when they become adjacent to the void husk, they then return to the physical space and are no longer intangible. Now, the great thing about this is you can get an ally out of a good spot by using this particular quick tech action to make them intangible. And then all they need to do to get out of it is go to a void husk. And because they're not hostile, or at least hopefully your allies aren't hostile, they're not slowed. So they just run over and they pop out on their turn, and then they can do the rest of their turn while no longer being intangible. An enemy that fails their system save needs to go to your Void Husk that is slowing them, whether they're intangible or not. And then when they pop out, they're still slowed because they're still next to a Void Husk. So this is a very insanely powerful passive that allows you to force enemies to go to your Void Husks to be able to be effective on the combat field. Now, this can sometimes backfire. Sometimes an enemy might be smart and just use this to force you guys to deal with it in some way. And you can do that using its active, which is Weighing of the Inequitable Hearts. My God. All right. So this one hostile character and one ally character, both within range 5 in line of sight of you, or a Void Husk, become intangible until the end of your next turn. The two characters must be chosen for this effect to occur. This ability is efficient, so when you use this, you get your core point back at the end of the scene. So you really want to use this active pretty much every combat if you can. And the interesting thing about this is it essentially allows an enemy and an ally to duel in this intangible realm until the end of your next turn. And because they're intangible, objects aren't blocking them. So this is a really good way to potentially get an enemy made of open to your ally. So you have an artillery ally that you're close to, or one of your Void Husks are close to, and an enemy that you're close to. Bam. Enemy is intangible. Ally is intangible. All the buildings don't matter anymore. Your ally can shoot them without having to worry about cover or anything like that. And the enemy really can't do anything if they're far enough away from your ally. And so, that being the case, this is an insanely powerful active and it's efficient. So, you can do this pretty much every combat if you're having a multi-combat mission, making it very good. The Calendula is a very interesting mech that very much plays around with intangibility. And that being the case, it's a mech that is really good at adjusting who gets to fight at any one time. Compared to the Minotaur, who the Minotaur is more about making an enemy stop moving as much as possible. The Calendula is more about forcing enemies to move in specific ways while slowing them down or whatever. It doesn't have the stun or immobilize potential that the Minotaur does, but I would argue it has a potentially much better slow potential considering the massive areas that its Void Husks can create. But it does have a bit of an action load compared to the Minotaur because creating a Void Husk requires a quick action, which you have to do after essentially taking a minimum of another quick action because it only works after you successfully hit with a tech attack. So the Calendula doesn't have a lot of opportunity to fire or do anything else. Well, I think the Minotaur has a little bit less of an action load. Now, overcharging is definitely a thing, and then the Calendula does have slightly better heat capacity in that way, but nonetheless, it's just something to consider. But let's take a look at the license to see how it stacks up with the use of these two frames. All right, so Mesmer Charges. This is actually an insane pickup for any tank or defender style mechs in the game. So if you're playing a defender, go ahead and consider getting 1 rank in Minotaur because Mesmer Charges is an insanely good system for 2 points for tanks. And the reason why is mostly Mesmer Beacon. Now, you throw the beacon, which is essentially a grenade within range 5. Enemy needs to make a system save, or the only voluntary movements they can make are towards you until the end of their next turn. So this forces enemies to move in your direction, and since you're playing a tank typically, this is going to make it so that they are more likely to attack you, or at the very least, they can't move towards your allies, which is your whole thing. Now, for the Minotaur and the Calendula especially, this is a very good pickup. For the Minotaur, I'm not quite so sure, because again, while the Minotaur has a lot of HP, since it doesn't have armor, it's vulnerable to essentially all types of weapons, unlike the Calendula, which has at least 2 armor, making it pretty good against like auxiliary fire. So that being the case, I don't know exactly how this plays into the Minotaur, other than you're just forcing enemies to move in a specific direction, which is kind of the whole Minotaur thing. And because you can't really die while operating a Minotaur, that's not necessarily a bad thing. Now, the Mesmer Mine also actually works insanely well. And this is one of the reasons why, if you're going this route, you're going to want to invest a lot in your engineering to get as many limited as you can, because this is a limited 2 system, so you can get 2 uses. But it works really well with itself, because when you use the Mesmer Mine here, which my face is blocking a little bit, characters, it creates a 2 burst exploding area where the enemy needs to make a system save or become immobilized until the end of their next turn. So you can use Mesmer Beacon to force an enemy to come towards you, or just not move because there's a Mesmer Mine there and they would have to go over it. So it works really well. And I really, really like Mesmer Charges, because for tanks, it's a really good pickup. For the Calendula, it's very fun. And for the Minotaur, at the very least, with the Mesmer Mines, you can prevent enemies from moving in certain areas, which I think is the better use rather than the beacon, which, again, like, its lack of armor just makes it so vulnerable, even if it has so much HP. Also, here at rank 1, we have the Viral Logic Suite, which is another 2-point system, and this gives you access to a bunch of new invades. And actually, that's a majority of the Minotaur Calendula license, which is a bunch of invade actions. And this plays a lot more in the Minotaur's favor than it does in the Calendula, because the Minotaur, again, wants to be at slightly further range, and it has a better action economy, but obviously invades count as tech attacks, so you can use the Calendula's general effect with the invade. But still, regardless, let's look at what it does. So Logic Bomb's really good. All characters of your choice within a burst 2 of your target must make a system save or become slowed until the end of their next turn, or longer if they don't end their turn adjacent to any character. So Logic Bomb, actually, you want to throw onto an ally. Now, if an ally accepts your invade, they don't suffer the heat that normally comes with invade. So Logic Bomb actually allows you to scatter enemies away from an ally if an ally is becoming overrun. This is actually a pretty solid system, and not only that, but you can just target an enemy if they're clustered up, making Logic Bomb a very good AoE control ability for enemies when they're grouped up, or if they're stacking onto one of your allies. And the Minotaur actually has a special feature kind of with this as well, considering when any character becomes, engaged with it, they can't move. So you can Logic Bomb yourself and force multiple enemies to be moved in this way. So the Logic Bomb is very interesting. Now, Banish is really good, and it's potentially very devastating. So when you banish an enemy until the end of their next turn, they take 2 heat for every space they voluntarily move, up to a maximum of 6 heat, or essentially 3 spaces. 6 heat is pretty devastating, and a lot of enemies in this game would stress out due to the 6 heat, which makes it insanely powerful. For certain types of enemies, this is a devastating ability that pretty much forces them to not move, which is good for you and your team. And it's just on a basic invade. And it only works on voluntary movement, so you can't force enemies to get a bunch of heat. But there are some ways kind of around this with some of the other licenses. So this is a very solid first tier pickup. And honestly, the first rank of Minotaur, I feel, could be worked into so many builds. So if you're not sure, or you don't really have any other frames you want to add to your repertoire, I would definitely consider the first rank of the Minotaur license. At rank 2, along with the Minotaur and the Calendula, we have Aggressive System Sync. This is another 2-point system, my bad. And it has 2 really cool full tech actions, which full tech actions are somewhat rare. Not many licenses have a ton of them, and they're very, very powerful, but they are full tech actions, so you have to, it's what you're dedicating your turn to, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, but it's something to consider. So Chains of Prometheus are very interesting. So on hit, the target automatically takes 4 heat. That's nuts. And they take 2 heat for the rest of the scene anytime they're more than 3 range from you at the end of their turn. They can end this effect by spending a full action, so both quick actions, to make a system save against it. This can only affect one character at a time. Change of Prometheus forces enemies to come to you. This is great on so many defender mechs, and it does so much heat. This is a pretty solid build for any like heat builds in the game. I would say Chains of Prometheus is an insanely powerful tech pickup if your mech is based on, using tech actions. It's very good. The Minotaur, this is a lot more fun because you can use this and the enemy has to make a sprint towards you, or their system just gets fried. The Calendula, this is also good though because it forces enemies to be close to you, and if you're on one of your husks or whatever, they also just get shredded. So yeah, Chains of Prometheus is really good. Now, Excommunicate is good in certain situations. It's a little bit more niche. So I'm gonna hide my camera here because I'm right in the way. So Excommunicate is another full tech action here that you make on a character within sensors. And on a hit for the rest of the scene, the first time in a round they move adjacent to one of their allies, or they start their turn next to one of their allies, both them and their ally takes 3 heat. This effect can end similarly to Chains of Prometheus when it takes a full action to make a system save, and similarly, only one character can be affected by this effect at a time. So that being the case, these are really good. Chains of Prometheus force the enemies to come to you, and Excommunicate forces enemies to spread out. Now, Lancer's a game that very typically is based on enemies kind of all over moving on the battlefield. It's battlefield etiquette, and not only that, but enemies just don't want to be grouped up because there's so many explosive weapons out there. It's just not beneficial. So Excommunicate is not super good unless enemies are moving in a very specific defensive pattern. But Chains of Prometheus are really good, and it's very solid for disrupting enemy formations. So at the very least, I 100% say that this one is worth it just for Chains of Prometheus alone, and you get the extra benefit of Excommunicate. And there are ways you can group enemies up really easy by like ramming an enemy into another one. Or actually, this works really well with things like the Black Witch that has a lot of attractor kind of abilities or abilities to move enemies. So if you're going with the Black Witch, I think Excommunicate can be an insanely powerful system. Also here at rank 2, we have a Minotaur Carver, another 2-point system here, and we get the Ophidian Trek. This teleports a target 1d6 plus 1 spaces directly towards you, or as close as possible. If this effect would move them to a space occupied by a character, object, or whatever, the teleport fails. So this is a come get over here kind of move, invade tech action, really good. And this is good for the Minotaur because any enemies that essentially get adjacent to it are then just engaged and stop moving. So that being the case, Ophidian Trek is very solid for that reason, but it works better on the Calendula, who wants enemies to be close to it so it can shred them as long as they're slowed. Fold Space is actually more of a support action than it is actually for enemies, because what it does is your target becomes not even intangible. They just blink out of space until the start of its next turn. It then returns into the space it was in or into the next free space. So Fold Space is really good to drop on an ally because the ally can't be affected by anything until the start of their next turn. And this isn't even intangible. Intangible might not have even been a thing when this one was first created. Honestly, I don't know. But they're gone. They're not even intangible or anything. They can't be affected until the start of their next turn. So it makes your allies very safe. Now, this is also really good for taking an enemy out if the enemy has a lot of reactions that you don't want it to have. This is good if an enemy is stopping your ally from doing something with its reactions. But honestly, most of the time you're not going to want to throw this on an enemy because you just can't do anything. Not you or your allies can do anything until it goes, which is not good. So this is really good to use on your allies more than your enemies. But both of these are also really good, and I love how it just affects the space and positioning on the battlefield. I think particularly the Minotaur license is really good for forcing enemies into positions they don't want to be. Another system that, again, is really good on defender-style mechs. All right, so we're getting to the last part of the license. I know this video is going a bit long, but you know, these double frame licenses, they're always like this. But before we get to the next part, if you would so please, if you're enjoying the content, leave a like so that other people have a higher chance of seeing this, and subscribe if you want to see more Lancer or just TTRPG content in general. It's, you know, we talk all things tabletop here. It's a very fun channel to be on. And we have a Discord linked in the description. We are 250 members strong with people looking for games of all kinds, especially recently with Lancer. So if you want to join our community, check us out in the description below. But let's go ahead and take a look at the final set of systems here in rank 3. All right, first up at rank 3, we have a 3-point system, so a bit expensive. Activate Interdiction Field. And essentially what this one does is you create a 3-burst field around you, and until it's deactivated as a quick action, you become slowed for the duration, but any hostile characters that start their turn within the affected area or enter it for the first time must succeed a system save or become slowed until the end of their next turn. Now, there is an endpoint here that I don't understand. I think this needs to be errated to make more sense. It says, only characters of your choice within the field can teleport or consider the area of the field valid space for teleportation. I don't know how often that comes up, and this prevents enemies in the area from teleporting, but it's only a 3-burst field, and even if they're slowed, it's very easy to get out of that field and then use any kind of teleportation. And because of the way this is worded, it says only characters of your choice within the field can teleport or considering the area of field valid for teleportation. The second part just doesn't make sense. Does it mean that enemies who are already in the field can't teleport into it? I want to say that the intent is you can't teleport into this field unless you let them, which makes more sense and actually would add a lot more use to this overall ability, but only against enemies that teleport, which, to be honest, there's not a lot of teleporting enemies in the game. So this is a very weird one. This is only really good if you're going up against like specific types of enemies or other Lancer mechs. So I don't like Interdiction Field. I think it's a very specific system. And for 3 system points, I really just don't see you getting a lot of value out of this particular one. But there might be some niche situations that's handy. But still, 3 system points? I don't know. The only good thing is that you activate it and it's activated until you turn it off. So you don't need to keep using actions to keep it going. But I don't know. Interdiction Field, I'm not sure. But hey, if you found a good use for it, let me know down in the comments below. I'd love to hear any strategies using any of the systems, really, from the license. Last but not least, we have a Law of Blades, and this is actually a really, really good pickup. For 2 system points, you get 2 really cool full tech actions. So first, you have Predator Prey Concepts. Essentially what it does is when you activate it and you successfully hit with it, the enemy must attack a different character or object of your choice with a single weapon as a reaction. And although you choose their target and weapon, they count as having taken the attack and the reaction. So this provokes any other reactions or effects that are based on enemies making attacks or reactions. The whole point of Law of Blades is this is just a puppet system. This just allows you to control an enemy to do pretty much whatever you want. Now, they are full tech actions, but for a full tech, you could turn an enemy artillery against one of its allies, which is very powerful. Slave Systems is just like the same thing, only this time it's specifically for, my face is in the way. It's specifically for boosts, stabilize, improvise attacks, grapples, or ramming. So this is a very interesting one because it actually works really, really well with the Viral Logic Suite with Banish. Because it says, for every space they voluntarily move. Now, with the Law of Blades specifically, it says, although you choose the action and its target, if relevant, they count as the target taking the action and reaction. So that being the case, you can force the enemy to boost and pretty much stress themselves out. It's a very powerful system combination. Now, the only hangup is Slave System and Banish is hard because this is only until your target's next turn. So, in order to use this, you essentially need to use an action to throw this on the enemy. You need to use your overcharge, and then you need to use Slave Systems. That is a pretty big action load, but it can stress an enemy out in like a single go, as long as both your tech attacks hit. So that being the case, it's very powerful. And just being able to force the enemy to even grapple or ram one of their allies is pretty good. It's like Law of Blades is the perfect full tech. I take control of your systems and tell your mech what to do. Now, it doesn't have, it is limited because you can either force them to attack or to boosts to get them in position or to grapple ram or whatever. So you can't do these both in the same turn. But there's so many situations I could see predator prey concepts working and tons where slave systems can work that honestly for 2 system points, Law of Blades is an insanely good pickup, unlike its competitor here, Interdiction Field, also at rank 3, which is more expensive and way more niche and harder to use, in my opinion. But yeah, that's going to be the Minotaur license. It's a very cool mech. It's a strange hacker mech that wants to be a defender without having the traits of a defender, which I think is very interesting. The Minotaur itself is one of the safest mechs in the game because you just can't die while you're piloting it. And the Calendula is a very fun and interesting mech design. One of the more interesting ones in the horse line, in my opinion. So this is a really good license. And I said several times before, the first rank of this has so many good pickups, whether you're a defender or hacker, that I can see many builds using at least the first rank of the Minotaur license. But that's going to be it for this video. Next time, we're going to be taking a look at the Sherman, which is a little hard to see here. But the Sherman is a striker artillery frame. It's a really cool one. It's one of the best like damager frames in the game. So I'm very excited to talk about that. And we're getting to the end. We only have a couple more Harrison Armory, a few more of the Pegasus, and a few more. We have a little bit more to go on both IPS North Star and Smith Shimano. They just have extra mechs. But I'm very excited to kind of get into all this with you all. And then maybe we'll start looking at some of the third-party mechs in the game. I'm debating on what I would want to do, but I'm very interested in looking into some of the third-party content since a lot of people will vouch for it very heavily. But let me know down in the comments what kind of stuff you want to see from Lancer or other TTRPG games. Anyway, that's going to be it for me. Thank you all so much for watching. Good luck with your games. Leave the bad luck to me. And I'll see y'all next time. Bye.